Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. The purpose of our show is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution. Here, we talk about all things recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread. Hey, Food Junkies listeners, Clarissa here. I'm so excited for part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Anita Federici. I always think it's fun to know how these conversations come together. And let me tell you, this behind-the-scenes story is a good one. So as most of you know, I had a history of receiving treatment from the eating disorder field in my 20s for anorexia, bulimia, and laxative abuse. This treatment left me feeling so misunderstood, not heard, and very deflated about the possibility of recovery. In order to better serve my clients, I decided it was still important for me to connect with local eating disorder experts and train in the latest interventions for eating disorder treatments. I did my research and decided that Dr. Federici was the expert that I wanted to take the course from. She offered a DBT course on the foundational concepts for the treatment of eating disorder. Thanks to Anita, I learned that there are other ways to treat eating disorders that were different from the treatment I received so early in my journey, and that a self-compassionate approach is possible. When I first heard about food addiction, I had reached out to some of these previous treatment providers to share my joy about my recovery and tell them I had found another way through limiting my use of ultra-processed foods. The response I received from them was crickets. So I had real hesitation in sharing about food addiction in Anita's course. However, I knew if I wanted anyone to speak to eating disorders on the podcast, it would be her. So here's where the story gets even better. I was headed to a Nordic spa with one of my best friends who owns an olive oil company, and we were doing some deliveries on the way. We had a few deliveries in Midland, and my friend Jody said one of them was a psychologist. Sure enough, the next thing I knew, I was in Dr. Federici's house speaking with her about food addiction and asking her to be on our podcast. Dr. Tarman and I are so grateful I did because this conversation has been so valuable to us, and we hope it will be for you too. Today, we dive right into the food addiction conversation, and we can't wait for you to hear how it all came together. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show. I'd love to get your idea on what do you believe food addiction exists?
Oh, geez, that is.
I know it's
right at it, right? You know what I would say? Because I'm very dialectical. Because I believe in that as a way of understanding the world. I know that I don't know a lot of things. I know there's a lot of controversy about this concept of food addiction. I've seen that play out many times over my career. And I've also, my own experience is that I think there's overlap. I think I don't know. I think that the neuroscience is evolving. I think that there are similarities and then there's differences. And that's where we can talk more about that.
Can you elaborate a bit? Because it's the controversy. And what are the similarities and differences from your perspective? Because we have our own opinion, but we want to hear your.
I'd be curious to, as we go through this part of the podcast, I'm curious. I think the biggest, controversy sounds too vague. I think where people feel uncomfortable from the eating disorder side, when people talk about food addiction, in my experience has been that it's how we understand addiction itself. What does it mean to be addicted to something? So again, some of it is linguistic, semantic. What does it mean? And so some people say addiction in the traditional sense means that somebody develops tolerance to a substance or to something. They develop tolerance and then they develop characteristic withdrawal symptoms. And so some people have argued that is not exactly the same thing when it comes to food. Some people argue it's exactly the same thing that happens with food, right? And so there's that kind of piece. The other piece is that people, I think, would argue that in one stance, for substances, for example, people have to learn to live without. It's an abstinence model, right? You need to not use cocaine or alcohol, what have you. Eating is something that you have to live with. So they're two different, like one is not something you need to sustain life. The other one you need to sustain life. And so there's been arguments on both sides of the fence about, is it true addiction when it's something you have to live with?
And if I can just jump in, those of us who say that food addiction is not a good term, we should be actually using the term ultra processed food addiction, because we don't have to actually eat that. So what does the eating disorder community, where is the squirming around that concept that yes, food is something we need, but we don't need cereal. We don't need candy.
I can hear all my colleagues and the whole history of my training loud around me. Okay, so I will represent some different views for you, right? For our viewers, right? Our listeners. So one is when I was trained 25 years ago, okay, and this still exists in many eating disorder programs. I was trained that in order to treat the eating disorder, the person had to learn to eat all foods and not be afraid of foods, right? So when I worked in the hospitals, we'd be like, here are the Easter eggs that you have to eat because it's Easter, and here you have to have cake and you have to have all these different things. Now, on one hand, that grew out of if you think about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, a lot of that treatment is exposure with response prevention, right? Geez, I remember working at the Anxiety Treatment and Research Center in Hamilton. One of some of my best experiences. Oh, what a great crew. And we would do things like, so somebody had OCD and obviously with their consent, let's say they had contamination fears. You might be in a bathroom stall touching toilets and then touching yourself, which sounds ridiculous. And yet, ironically, it would be the thing that would help the person go, oh, so I'm not going to just drop dead when I touch something that's disgusting. Okay, so I believe that a lot of early eating disorder treatment evolved from how we treated anxiety disorders in general, right? Which is exposure to the feared foods, the feared experiences, so that people could habituate. So it wasn't to say that everybody should eat cake and sugar all the time. That wasn't the intention. The intention was to learn that even if you did eat cake, even if you did have cookies, even if you did have the fruit cup that is sugar and not water, you can survive that. And
that was in an era when the food wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now.
Yeah. Yes. I'm reminded of the decades that I've been in this. Yes. And so I think that's where that has come from. So I think you still have people that would say you are not adequately treating an eating disorder without that. However, there is a more, I would say in the last 5 years, just thinking about literature in my head, again, led by Cindy Bulick. Remember, she's the one that she's done the research on biology and metabolism. She and Nancy Zucker have published some wonderful papers looking at how we feed people based on biology and genetics. So for example, she would say, why do we feed people in these, again, highly processed inflammatory foods when we know that they have gastrointestinal difficulties and systems? And so that I think you're starting to see, maybe this is the bridge between where we've been and where you're talking about, that there is a softening.
Yeah.
In some sects of the eating disorder field that are more open to, why do we have to feed people a certain way? Can we feed them in a way that is less inflammatory? And that actually looks at gut-brain interactions and how different foods and the gut microbiome can be affected.
Yeah.
I'm saying a lot of things right now, so I'll pause.
What you're saying is just music to our ears. You and Dr. David West, we're seeing what I think is a sensible integration of some of the same materials, which is just wonderful. Now, one of the people that has been talking about this for some time is Dr. Carolyn Davis, also from York University in the 90s and 2000s. And here's the model that she presented that I've picked up on. And I'd like your opinion on this idea in terms of the integration of food addiction and the eating disorder model. So she presented the idea that because she couldn't seem to explain some of the eating disorder behavior that just seemed so addictive in her clientele or in her research subjects, she suggested an idea that it started with eating disorder and then through neuroadaptation to the drug effect, ultra-processed foods, that there was an actual changing, a neural hormonal changing that then developed an addiction platform. So it was almost like a continuum morphing until we got to food addiction. So what's your idea about that? Is that plausible? I'm sure it's not.
I think lots of things are plausible. I think this is one of the things I always feel so stimulated by is that we just don't know. We just don't know enough. And to minimize or to shut down different viewpoints or different theories, I think is not wise for us in this field. We still don't have an evidence-based treatment for anorexia. We still struggle with people that have all kinds of eating disorders and co-occurring disorders. Nobody has the 100%, this is what it is and this is what's going on and this is how you treat it. The first thing I would say is, one, I think that Dr. Davis was one of the first people that I was ever exposed to back, I guess it was the 1990s.
I feel the same way as you.
I know, right? I'm like,
time is marching too quickly.
Geez, it is, but I also love that wisdom. I love history. And so I think part of staying out of polarization, because I just see it so much, is this fighting, this defensiveness. Part of staying out of that for me is understanding that things evolve. They evolve. They made sense at one time. They are changing. That's just how life happens. And so Dr. Davis was one of the first people who I was exposed to this construct of, could eating disorders be an addiction of sorts? Could that be? I think there's so much a bidirectional relationship between our genetics and how we eat, and then how we eat affects our biology and our genetics and our metabolism. Like we said earlier, which comes first, chicken or egg? And I'm going to go, I don't know that it matters, but I definitely think there are interactions that go on that can facilitate things like food addiction. I think,
would it be reasonable to say, I know that we could envision an eating disorder with food addiction development, something like that, a food addiction subtype?
I think I hesitate only because I know what goes on in the broader community. I think that is a harder sell. I'm just going to be very transparent.
Yeah, please.
Just because I think people still get very defensive about this. And I'm still trying to explore and understand it myself, to be honest. And so I think that I think there's often subtypes, and I think eating disorders are much more complicated than the way they were initially conceptualized. And so when I think about what you're talking about, and I think about Cindy Bulick's work and all the genetics research and how that dovetails with addictions literature, then I think that there's a bigger story there than where the eating disorder field has felt comfortable going. And they're still largely uncomfortable going.
I can see the discomfort because the treatment can be so different. Like one is restrictive and one is not.
Yeah, I'm really curious because this will speak to treatment as well. As I would have considered myself someone who struggled with eating disorders my whole life. Started with anorexia, moved to bulimia. Eventually, when bulimia stopped working, I moved to laxatives. I got treatment at St. Joe's in Hamilton. So I had really, but it didn't really seem to be the right modality for me because it didn't fix, change, help. And maybe I wasn't ready is what they told me, which wasn't helpful at the time. Either, and then I switched to alcohol again. And then I also had an addiction to prescription pills. With alcohol and prescription pills, it's like that, those take away the hunger, right? So those were key pieces for it. And obviously restriction was always present. And so upon getting treatment for alcoholism, I was introduced into the concept of food addiction, which was, hey, just eat whole foods and see how that does for you. It made my cravings for alcohol go away. I haven't had another restriction episode, and I really feel like I can eat all foods, except I don't eat ultra processed foods or sugar. And so the eating disorder field would see that as somewhat restrictive, but I'm curious, through the eating disorder lens, do you see anything through the neurobiology or what your take is on that?
First of all, I just love your transparency. I really have a lot of respect for lived experience and the fearlessness. It's not an easy role to occupy. It's getting better, but it comes with a lot of vulnerability. So I just wanted to first acknowledge that. For me personally, I feel that if you were my client and you said, look, Anita, this I'm eating in this way, and you are not having eating disorder symptoms and you're not medically unstable and you've got a quality of life, great. It was, there's still some medical concerns. I'm still deeply afraid of food. I will not go out and eat. I won't go to a birthday party. I think about some of the adolescents. I won't go. I go, are you living a quality of life that makes sense for you? I don't feel like it's my job to tell you that you have to eat in a certain way unless it's going to kill you. Then I'm going to be like, listen, you got to eat more. So here's an example, with ARFID. CBT for ARFID talks about when you're trying to feed someone, start with volume first, not variety. And I'm like, why aren't we just treating all eating disorders? What do you like to eat? What works for you? What works for your body? How about we start there? But that's not traditional. Then there's, again, in ARFID, they will target certain foods if it's interfering with quality of life. For example, if you said to me, I'll never go out on a date because I will not go eat in a restaurant unless there's, these kinds of foods, I might say, you could do that. And is it limiting just your social life? So we might do that. If you had a fear of choking on certain foods, like I remember I had a young person that would never go to a birthday party, because it was always pizza and they were terrified of choking. I had to work with that person, not because you have to eat pizza, because I needed you to know that even if you did have to eat pizza at a party, you can handle that. And even if you choke a little bit, most people choke and the body's pretty sophisticated. So again, I don't subscribe to, it's like vegetarianism. Remember vegetarianism in the 80s and 90s, right? And the eating disorder field was like, you can't be a vegetarian and heal from your eating disorder. And I'm like, yeah, you can. Now, it's way harder. You have to eat a lot more. You got to be really meticulous to make sure that you're getting the vitamins and minerals. But as long as somebody is eating in a way that sustains your body and your brain, I don't know. I don't get into like, you have to eat a certain way. That is not everybody's opinion, though. I will be very honest with you. But that's the reality of the field.
By way of illustration, see what you think about this in terms of that intersection of food addiction and eating disorder. My own personal experience is that I started off with having an issue with alcohol, and I wanted to stop because I was in university and alcohol was getting in the way of my studies. And then when I stopped, I found that all I could do is think about food. And I had not in the past. I always liked sugar, but it wasn't an obsession. And it became an obsession that was bigger than alcohol. So that, to my mind, not at that time, but later, because I called myself a bulimic for many years. But then later I thought that was just the transfer of one addiction to another. Now, had I gone to an eating disorder professional, which I did at the time, but it was early days. This was the 70s. Oh my God, even longer. What would an eating disorder perspective be for somebody who has a clear history of addiction? And to me, it's a shoo-in that this is a transfer addiction. But what would an eating disorder perspective be as an alternative?
As an alternative to traditional eating disorder care?
No, to making the assumption this is clearly food addiction, which is the assumption I made. But
I see.
If I had gone to an eating disorder professional now, where there's so much more information, what would they say about that kind of behavior?
I would hope that what they would do is look at biotemperament and neurobiology, that they would probably look at the fact that there is something about your particular genetic biology makeup that does make you more susceptible to addiction or to bulimia. And again, we're talking about approach versus avoidance of stimuli. We're talking about could be impulse control, could be risk aversion versus risk tolerance. These are all biotemperament. You don't pick these things about yourself. So for me, if you were coming to me with this presentation, I think it would be very important for us to be looking at this whole picture and how both the alcohol use and the bulimia are actually linked. Mm-hmm. And not separate illnesses. That said, there are things I would do as an eating disorder expert. There are things I would do to make sure that I'm targeting your relationship with food and body that probably someone with just substance use training would not do.
For example, this is great.
I'd be looking at how are you feeding yourself? What does a typical day of eating look like? What is the relationship between your emotions and the way that you cope? I think these things are coping mechanisms so I always say to my clients, substance use, self-harm, suicide, binging, purging, whatever. That's not the problem. That is the way you are trying to solve the problems, right? So the problem with much of mental health is that we laser focus on that on the symptoms that are above the surface, right? Like we go, okay, let's target your binging. Let's target the substance use. Yes. However, it's what's underlying all of these things. And I think that is genetics, neurobiology, biotemperament, and sociocultural influences that create that perfect storm that we've talked about.
The one piece that's different, because we go with all that too, this is really an interesting conversation. The one piece that's different is that the food addiction professional would say, but it's also the drug effect of the food that's interfering. It's that piece, and therefore we need to remove that, which then, of course, introduces the concept of restriction, which is therefore avoidant behavior and phobic behavior. We see that phobia I have a phobia. I admit to particular foods. No, I'm not going near them because they'll cause grief. Ice cream, cashews.
Yeah.
So that's where the...
And that's the crux of it. That's where we get stuck. And I can see both sides. Like I really, truly see the validity. I see the validity to what you're saying. Again, at the International Conference on Eating Disorders last year in Washington, D.C., the treatment plenary was all focused on gut-brain interactions. As they relate to both addictions and eating disorders. And that work was well over my head and fascinating. And so it was refreshing to see that. So I see that there's validity to, are there certain ways of eating, or again, like we talk about inflammatory or foods that cause problems that instead of going, oh, that's just your eating disorder. No, it's actually part of your neurobiology. And I also see the fear. I can validate the fear on restricting anything because that's how a lot of us were raised academically. And there's this belief that if you're restricting any kind of food type, that could reinforce the eating disorder. So what I do with that is find a synthesis. Each person's different. Like I said, if we can find a way for you to eat that does not make the eating disorder loud, that's great. And if we can find a way that actually soothes the biology that drives the addiction and the eating, if you think about these things, and I'm sure you have a lot more, is that the eating, emotion regulation, coping in life, they're all connected. To separate these things, I think we do a disservice.
Another question. One of the things we see a lot of in the food addiction world is volume addiction. What we mean by that is it can even be healthy food. It can even be too much celery, too many carrots. And we explain, actually, we're trying to explain, we don't have the understanding, but there's been some suggestive hypotheses that that's the stretch receptors in the gut that trigger off the parasympathetic relaxation response. Others, it's the serotonin in the gut. Maybe even the microbiota. We don't know. We're looking at the mechanics of stretch in volume. And what do you, I guess, in the binge eating disorder and the bulimia, you must have a different explanation. So where's the similarity disconnect there?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of us in the ED field that are looking more at those things. So I wouldn't say that we don't. I think that the idea more in binge, let's say take binge eating disorder, is that it's a cycle in which somebody is restricting eating, and that the very nature of any kind of restriction sets off a particular biological response, an evolutionary response, right? To seek out food and to overeat from an evolutionary perspective, from a survivalist perspective. So the theory is that, and people with binge eating disorder often validate that or endorse that, where they're trying to diet during the day, they're trying their intermittent fasting, but this is where you get back to this Wegovys and the bariatric. You can restrict for periods of time, but for a subgroup of people, that sets off a very particularly strong, almost an overriding urge or behavior to eat and eat until they're uncomfortably full. And that it's part of you can't just look at they'll say you can't just look at the binging or the volume without looking at the whole trajectory of how is this person actually feeding themselves throughout the whole day, what is going on. So I think that's part of the theoretical framework.
And restricting. Now here's how I've explained that. And I'd like your take on it. Personal take, and then what the eating disorder community would take, because I realize that you're a bit of a renegade in that community, thankfully for us. So restricting, there's a person restricts. What ends up happening is that dopamine inspires us to eat, and the dopamine goes higher because the hungrier you are, the more that you're becoming extremely hyperglycemic, but also your dopamine is high and all you can think about is food. And that actually is its own little high. And I've often wondered, is anorexia a form, like you mentioned earlier, that the anorexic is not hungry? And I would say they're not hungry because they're overly stimulated because of the dopamine, because their dopamine is, so they're not hungry and they're thinking it, like the anorexic is thinking about food all the time. They're not eating it, but they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
So what's your take on the idea that this is, again, it's an addictive type profile of abundance of dopamine?
I would first say, I don't feel like I know enough about the latest science on dopamine and anorexia for me to sit here and be like, so as a geneticist might, I'm like, you got to talk to Cynthia Bulick.
Yeah.
What I would say is that I think we're learning a lot more. I'm just looking at anorexia for a moment, not to exclude the other eating disorders, but we know that restriction, it could be related to dopamine. It may well be appetite, serotonin, and dopamine are going to be implicated. And I think that it's complicated by, is it all dopamine? Is it not? And there's just different variations of how people experience that starved state. So the other thing too is that people with anorexia, there's a subtype that it's such an anomaly, right? Like, how is it that people can go so long at low body weights or without food? Like, it defies survival in some ways, and then it makes sense for survival. On one hand, we don't eat for a day, or we're not going to drop dead, which is a good thing for survival. But on the other hand, you've got people that it's as though that process never kicks back in, that they just don't desire food, and they stay highly active. For example, there's even studies on mice and rats that'll show that if you starve certain subgroups of mice, they will exercise themselves to death. So is that all accounted for by dopamine? I don't know. I think it could be dopamine plus endocrine plus gastrointestinal. I don't know, but we do know that for anorexia, the soothing, the quieting down of both cognitive and physical symptoms is significant when they are in a restrictive state.
Yeah. And what you talked about there, that's exactly how Carolyn Davis got into it. She was actually, before eating disorder, she was interested in this starvation, and that actually promotes exercise.
That's right. That's right. I remember her well from York, and then I remember her literature, which makes sense to look at these pieces. And again, so much of our field has been siloed, and there's narrowly defined views of what causes and maintains these illnesses. The fact of the matter is that we are going to do better when we are working together, even when we don't agree. It's okay. Actually, it's great when we don't agree, because from that usually generates something that never existed before.
There is a key piece that is different. We mentioned it before, but I want to somehow conclude on that piece, which is when it's an addiction model, we look for what we need to abstain from. How can you work with an eating disorder? Because we have people who are dual diagnosed or appear to be.
Yeah.
What do we do when the person is phobic about a particular food because it is a drug food for them, but we don't want to promote over restricting? How can we work with this?
I think you have to be done. Again, this is me. The field would, I think, say you have to keep going after that fear of food. I know. And for some people, I might too. It would depend on who they are and what's going on and what does this all mean. But I spend a lot of time making sure that my client and I are collaboratively understanding. It's instead of me putting the puzzle together by myself, I'm like, let's come over here. Does this make sense? So that the client and I both go, yes, that makes sense. And then we create a plan. For me, I look for the synthesis, right? And DBT allows me to do that, whereas other treatments don't. So I would look at, like I said before, is there a way I might even experiment with it? Okay, let's do it. Let's try it. Great. Let's not eat processed foods for a while and see what happens. And what does it mean to make sure you're getting enough nutrient calories, right? So the thing that I see happen a lot is that in the spirit of trying to not eat something because it causes even physical pain, like there are people that have slow motility and all kinds of things that they're like, oh my gosh, every time I eat that, my IBS flares up. I'm like, okay, are we really going to keep eating that? Or they have celiac or they have something. But what I see though is that they still don't know how to feed themselves properly. So they often need help with what does it mean to go to the grocery store? What does it look like when it's a family dinner? How are you actually making sure that you're getting the nutrients so that you're not actually malnourished at any weight, right? And this is the thing with ARFID is that you have people that eat, they can eat enough volume, but their vitamins and minerals are completely depleted because they're not eating enough variety.
Yeah.
So I'm more interested in sustaining life functions than I am about, so again, is it restriction or is it part of the conceptualization? Like restriction to me is I'm not eating.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not eating because I'm scared of food. I'm not eating. Like it's not restriction to me. If you're eating throughout the day, you're just making choices about what you're eating. Do you know what I mean?
Restricting. So not food addict. This is something that I admit I feel quite bad about. Sometimes a normie, a person who doesn't have a problem with an eating disorder, will stumble on the I'm sweetening up sugar-free for life. And they'll say, I think I'm going to quit sugar. Then they email me back and say, I ate too much sugar, but now when I'm restricting, all I think about is sugar. I feel like I'm actually inducing a problem from the addiction framework. I can't really explain that, and I feel bad about it. Can you explain that?
See, this is a great example of why we have to really take time to understand who's sitting across from us. And like I said, there's no blood test where I go, oh, you're going to react that way. You're not.
Yeah.
This is why you have to be somewhat experimental. Like for some people, and restricting in any way primes them. There's just some people who are just highly sensitive and their biology goes, whoa, I need sugar, I need food. So that's what I mean by it depends. I think
they have an underlying eating disorder that I'm actually promoting.
I don't know. I guess you'd have to ask. They might, here's the other thing. There's a lot of people that walk around with the underlying genes load the gun, but it never evolves into an eating disorder. And then they try something, right? They get sick, they have surgery, they try intermittent fasting, they try to cut out sugar, I don't know, whatever. And all of a sudden you start to see stuff. That to me I would assess for an eating disorder in terms of the history, in terms of family history, but also in terms of, do they have other eating disorder symptoms? And what's actually going on with their eating? Are they restricting a lot now? Are there other symptoms? Are they obsessing about food? That's not, you don't want someone obsessing about food and body weight and, that. So I would make sure to assess to make sure
because we could be priming the pump, which is the last thing I want to do. Yeah.
There's a wonderful video. Gosh, if you Google, again, I talk about Cindy Bulick because she's just been a powerhouse in the field and she's so articulate. And if you were to Google Dr. Cynthia, she's been in so many documentaries and one called Gain. And she does these little snippets where she actually looks and shows some of her genetics research and why some people that restraint or restriction, even if it's done in a really innocent way, can actually create the beginning of the eating disorder, right? It just is what it is. Some people just have a biology that, right? And this is why I get scared with the medications we talked about and with bariatric surgeries that you actually just don't know how that person's going to respond to that kind of restraint and restriction.
So I'm wondering if you have any idea, how can we start to bridge the gap between eating disorders and food addiction? Because certainly Molly and I have trained, probably more predominantly in food addiction than eating disorders, but we are one of the few professionals in our food addiction field who really works at the intersection. And I can identify when I'm working one-on-one with a client, if they are letting me know that this restriction is actually creating more of a reward propensity. Exactly. And so it may be that I have to treat the eating disorder before we can start to look at the food addiction, or it's so nuanced. And so how can we bridge those gaps together?
I think, first of all, I think you're doing it by staying open to the fact that there are different theories. I think it's dangerous when any of us get into things where we say, that's it, I know the answer, and it's just this. We don't know that. Nobody knows that. No matter which side people are coming from, I tend to sit back and look at the whole picture rather than, I'm not interested in polarizing. So I think the fact that you can sit with and say, okay, what might I be missing? But I wish the whole field did that. I think that's one of the things that sitting in the intersection does. That's why I like DBT, because it's the whole nature of it is you're sitting in the intersection of multiple competing truths and trying to find forward movement.
How are you received in your community? I mean, you've obviously done quite a lot. You've got quite a name for yourself. Do people see you as being a renegade, as it were? Or I would say a forward thinker.
I think that it probably depends who you talk to. Just to be honest, you know what? I feel like I'm so well treated by my peers. I feel like I have really wonderful relationships with people across hospitals, levels of care, internationally. I feel so honored. And I also feel like I have a good relationship. Like I said, lived experience, experts by experience are near and dear to my heart. And so I feel like I think I have enough of a relationship with people that I can have these conversations. There's always a handful of people that don't like to sit in the gray zones, or probably who hear some of what I say and feel like I'm too flexible or I'm sure, for sure. And that's okay. That's okay. I try to appreciate where they come from and why they might see me that way. And that's all right. I lead by A, what wasn't there when I needed it, B, massive gaps in the field, and C, just a desire to work with people and just do it differently. And that's okay. It's okay to do it differently. The other thing I would say to bridge the gap, and again, you may or may not want to, but the Academy for Eating Disorders, they have these special interest groups, and there is one on substance use and addiction.
Yeah, Molly's in there.
Molly's in there. Okay. So,
yeah.
But that's something that whether you're involved or even your listeners, you can become a member. I don't get anything from promoting this. That's where some very interesting conversations happen. At least it's one of the places. So if you want, what I would love is for people that are looking at this through the addictions lens to show up more, and that people from the eating disorder lens are showing up more, and the trauma side. And like, to me, we should all be looking at things together as opposed to continuing to silo concepts and constructs.
Can you give us some hope in the food addiction world for the future of eating disorder and this potential intersection?
Yeah, I think that I think we've talked about it throughout these podcasts, which is look at the evolving neuroscience. Right? If you look at what we're seeing in eating disorders and you look at what we know in addictions, I think there's a lot more overlap than there is difference. So I think that, and I also know firsthand that the field is really shifting to look at co-occurring pieces. So I think that there's definitely a lot of hope. Now, it's interesting. Do you feel that there's not a place? Like when you say hope, do you feel like there's not a place at the table?
Thank you for asking that. I appreciate that. You are giving hope just by the virtue of saying that these people are building this concept and co-occurring issues. But I've spoken at various places, usually a hospital setting, where the eating disorder crowd, they're sitting at their tables, shaking their head. But so this was 10 years ago. You're giving me hope that actually there's a change, because we would like to see a conversation.
I think that I wish that and it's not just in eating disorders. I think that sometimes people forget how much we don't know. So I think that whenever I go in knowing that I hold different views, I try to figure out what will make sense about my audience. Why would the eating disorders hospital teams hear the term food addiction and go, I don't even want to listen to this. Yeah. Right? As opposed to finding, what I notice is that there's a lot of common language. I think when, certain terms people bristle about, and I wish people were more open. I think that's changing. I know it's changing, and it's still slow. So you have to be willing to tolerate the distress that people are not going to be always open to that. And that's okay. I think it comes from a lot of fear and a lot of lived experience historically. To be honest with you, I think that people see that as not scientific and I just don't think it's that clear cut. But I think that there absolutely is a place. And that's why I was like, where are the hubs where people are doing this? Because we all know that the more we get together, the better we can send messages.
And definitely we've had like other eating disorder professionals on the podcast before who have spoken about, if you're telling me that this food is a bully to you, would I invite you to have a bully in your house all day and spend all day with it? Probably not. That it's okay to understand that it's not restriction. It's not, especially if your quality of life is actually getting better by you not having that food in your life. So I do believe that there is a shift happening. I know David's spoken at conferences and has been much better receptive than he was, say, 5 years ago, that these conversations are starting to happen and there is interest. I think if we are able to get something in the DSM or the ICD and there was some level of like clinical validation, like it might be more generally accepted. And
it's always hard when it's not part of the diagnostic.
And I think that's a piece that we're working towards right now. And it's just still going to take maybe a few more years. Who knows?
Well, first, that is a slow moving train. We all know. And then what's interesting is that you have a lot of upset with the DSM itself. And there's a lot of people that kind of feel very upset about the way food and feeding and all kinds of things have been discussed or conceptualized. And so I feel like the way that I say this, and the last thing I'll say, that I feel like the eating disorder field is in the midst of an earthquake. And I'm here for it because I think it's...
What a great analogy. I love it.
I do, right? I feel like there's a lot of upset. I think where there were small fractures, there are big cracks now. I think there's a lot. So what does an earthquake do? It makes everybody nervous. People get freaked out. People panic. People avoid difficult things. They just want to survive. And that even in the field and with researchers and clinicians. But earthquakes are also necessary for evolution and growth because from earthquakes creates new soil. It unearths things that weren't there before. That's where I feel like we're at. So it's uncomfortable right now. It just is. We're in the middle of it. The earth is shaking and nobody really knows where to stand. And that's okay. That's okay. That's part of change. And that's how I envision it. So it'd be really interesting to see, even in 5 years, where are we given how much is going on right now? So thank you both for being renegades alongside with me. It's really nice.
You have always been a leader in the field when it comes to eating disorders, the way you treat, the way you just work with individuals. I'm in your area. And so I've been so honored to if I have anyone who comes to me necessarily with eating disorder as primary, the Center for Psychology and Emotional Regulation is where I send them in Midland. Can you tell us a little bit more about your clinic and what you do?
Oh, geez. Thank you. The way that I built the clinic was, even if I'm not the person to treat you, I want to help you try to navigate where on earth you can go, because it is not fun trying to figure out how to get help. And so many people feel misunderstood and abandoned really by systems. So we have an eating disorder track. I call them care pathways. We have one that's eating disorders where we can offer people CBT if that's what they want and it feels like a good fit. But my heart is in med DBT. I just love it. So that's the bulk of what I do. I do have a standard dialectical behavior therapy track because we work with a lot of suicide, self-harm. So we have that. I have a trauma track, and then we have a mood and wellness track. And a lot of our clients need all of those tracks, but there's a way that we work with people to figure out what makes sense now. At the end of the day, my aim is to be highly collaborative and integrative and to be deeply respectful of the dignity of who people are. That's really at the core of who I am and what I believe. And I just want to create safe spaces for people. That's really what I want. And if we're not it, like I said, that's fine. Let's figure out who else might be able to help you.
And that has so come across in our interview today, Anita. It's just so many times I was like, oh, it's just your words give hugs. It's just so much care.
Thank you so much.
It really is. So we do have one final signature question, and it is, if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about eating disorders, or maybe something about recovery from eating disorders, what would you tell her?
Oh, you were going to end on that? I gotta, oh gosh. If I had to pick one quick thing, I would tell her that she makes sense, that she makes so much sense. And there are people out there that are going to understand just how much she makes sense, that she's not wrong or bad or sick or hopeless or lost. She makes sense and she is surviving the best way she knows how. And there's a life out there for her. Oh, geez, if she just only knew. So just hang on and keep looking for the people who are going to get it, because they're there.
Right on.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anita, for your time, spending time for us to do both of these podcasts. Very enlightening for our population.
Thank you so much for including me. I just think it's so important. And it's been so nice to talk to both of you. I look forward to staying in touch and thank you so much.
Awesome. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life support group, I'm Sweet Enough. You can subscribe to our show in iTunes or Stitchers. That way you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon. If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. You can find their websites and email addresses in the show notes. Be sure to tune in every Friday when our new episodes drop. As Vera loves to say, the power is ours.